The photograph sat untouched for decades in a shoebox that smelled of dust, old paper, and something faintly metallic, like cold pennies pressed together. It showed a little girl standing alone in the summer of 1945, just weeks after the war ended. She was no older than 6. Her hair was neatly tied with a ribbon. Her dress was clean, pressed, and far too formal for play. In her arms, she held a cloth doll with button eyes and a stitched smile. At first glance, the photo looked harmless. Sweet, even. The kind of image families kept on mantles. The kind no one questions, until someone zoomed in on her hand. Before the zoom, people noticed the girl's eyes. They weren't frightened. They weren't happy either. They looked focused, as if she were listening to something just outside the frame. As if the doll wasn't a toy, but a responsibility. The photograph was taken behind a boarding house near the rail yards, temporary housing that filled up fast when soldiers came home and just as quickly emptied when people disappeared. Records from the town were incomplete. Many were burned in a courthouse fire in the early 1960s. What survived came in fragments, ration cards, school rosters, a death certificate without a cause, and the photo. When a private collector acquired it and scanned it at high resolution, he expected nothing more than to clean scratches and correct fading. That's when the first anomaly appeared. The little girl's right hand, wrapped around the doll's wrist, did not look like a child's hand. The fingers were too long. The knuckles too pronounced. The skin texture didn't match the rest of her body. It looked older. Veined. Tense. As if it belonged to someone else entirely. At first, it was dismissed as a shadow artifact. A trick of light. Old cameras did strange things. Film warped. Exposure lied. But the longer the image was studied, the harder it became to explain. The hand was not resting. It was gripping. The girl's name, according to a penciled note on the back of the photograph, was Margaret Lorne. No birth record could be found. No school enrollment. No mention of her in census data. But the boarding house existed. So did the photographer, a man named Edwin Hasker, who worked briefly documenting post-war civilian life. He vanished in 1946. No body was ever recovered. His last known work included 5 photographs. Only one survived. Margaret and the doll. The doll itself raised questions. It was handmade, not mass-produced. Its stitching was uneven. The cloth discolored in places, as if soaked and dried repeatedly. One button eye sat lower than the other. Its mouth was not smiling. It was straight. Severe. Intentional. When the image was enhanced further, something else emerged. The doll's left hand was missing, and Margaret's grip was not around the doll's arm, but around an empty sleeve, as if she were holding on to something that was no longer there, or something that could not be seen. Neighbors interviewed decades later remembered rumors. They remembered a child who never spoke, a girl who stood too close to adults, listening, a girl who refused to let go of her doll, even when sleeping, even when bathing. One woman recalled hearing Margaret cry through the boarding house walls late at night, not screaming, whispering, repeating the same phrase again and again, slow and careful, like a lesson being memorized. "He says not yet," she would say. "He says hold tighter." The war had just ended, but death had not left town. Trains still arrived at night. Some people came home wrong. Others never came home at all. And children noticed things adults refused to see. When the photograph was finally restored fully, contrast balanced, grain reduced, detail sharpened, the hand revealed its final secret. The fingernails were cracked, dirty, and under the nails, pressed deep into the skin, were thin, dark lines, like dried blood. Not Margaret's blood, someone else's. The collector shut down the project that same night. He said the room grew cold while he worked, that the image began to feel heavier the longer it stayed open on his screen, that when he closed his eyes, he could feel pressure around his own wrist, as if someone were testing his grip, seeing if he would let go. Because the hand in the photo was not Margaret's, and it was not the doll's. It belonged to something that needed to be held, something that did not want to be alone, something that had already chosen the girl. After the restoration was halted, the photograph did not disappear. It was locked inside a padded archival sleeve, placed in a drawer, and left alone. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Within days, the collector began waking up with soreness in his right hand. Not cramps, not numbness, pressure marks, thin, purplish lines around the wrist and knuckles, like fingers that had held on too tightly during sleep. He told no one. Instead, he returned to the image, because something about the girl would not let him stop. Margaret Lorne's face, when examined closely, showed micro-expressions that didn't align with childhood innocence. Her lips were slightly parted, not in surprise or joy, but concentration. Her eyes weren't focused on the camera. They were angled downward, toward her hand, toward the grip, as if she were monitoring it. A second scan revealed something even more unsettling. The skin tones on Margaret's arm and the strange hand did not match, not even close. Where her arm showed soft gradations of light and shadow, the hand appeared flat, dense, almost pressed into the photograph itself. The veins followed no natural pattern. The wrist bent at an angle impossible for a living limb. This was not motion blur. This was not damage. This was presence. The boarding house records, thin as they were, revealed one more detail. In early September of 1945, a child was reported missing from the property. Not Margaret, another girl. No name recorded. Only a note written in shaky ink. Last seen with doll. The doll. The more it was studied, the worse it became. Zooming in on the fabric revealed stains beneath the stitching, dark, irregular patches that did not align with normal wear. The cloth had been unstitched and restitched multiple times, as if something inside had been removed, then forced back in. And the empty sleeve. That sleeve wasn't collapsed the way cloth normally falls. It was stretched, pulled, as though something invisible still occupied it. A child psychologist consulted on the image offered a chilling interpretation. Margaret's posture, rigid shoulders, locked elbow, firm grip, matched that of a child restraining someone else. Not comforting. Not holding. Containing. That's when the collector noticed the background. Behind Margaret, near the edge of the frame, stood the boarding house wall. Wooden planks. Peeling paint. A narrow window. Inside the window's reflection, barely visible, was another shape. A second child. No face. Just the outline of a head. And a raised arm, reaching toward Margaret's hand. The photograph was never meant to show one child. It showed two. One was just no longer fully there. The town's oral history filled in what records could not. In the final weeks of the war, a soldier returned home unstable. He stayed at the boarding house. He had a daughter. He kept her locked in their room when he drank. One night, neighbors heard screaming. The next morning, the soldier was gone. So was the child. Margaret was seen later that day in the yard, holding her doll, holding something else. Children, it was said, were closer to the thin places. They could feel when something refused to move on, and sometimes, out of fear or kindness or obedience, they helped hold it here. The hand in the photo tightened the more it was studied. That was not imagination. Frame-by-frame comparison showed it clearly. The fingers curled in, increment by increment, as if responding to attention, as if feeding on it. The collector stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the same sensation. A small hand in his own. Too strong. Too cold. Not wanting to be dropped. And then the doll appeared in his apartment. He did not remember buying it. He did not remember bringing it inside. But it was there, sitting upright. One sleeve empty. The other, clenched. The doll was not supposed to exist outside the photograph. That was the thought that kept returning, over and over, like a nail tapped gently into the same place until it finally breaks skin. The collector stood in his apartment doorway for nearly an hour staring at it. It sat on a chair he never used. Its fabric was older than any modern replica. The stitching matched the photo perfectly, uneven, hand-pulled, deliberate. One button eye was lower than the other. The empty sleeve rested across its lap, limp but not collapsed. The other sleeve was clenched, not sewn shut, clenched. He didn't touch it. Instead, he searched for fingerprints. There were none. No dust disturbed. No sign of forced entry. The locks were intact. The windows closed. The only thing out of place was the doll, and the feeling in his right hand, which now throbbed as if bruised from the inside. That night, he dreamed of Margaret. She wasn't older. She wasn't younger. She was exactly as she appeared in the photograph, standing stiffly, eyes lowered, arm extended forward. But this time, there was no doll. She was holding a wrist. A grown wrist. His. Her grip was iron. And she whispered, very calmly, very carefully, like a child repeating rules. You can't let go yet. He isn't finished. He woke up screaming. His hand was numb. Purple marks circled his wrist, deeper than before. One nail-shaped crescent had broken the skin. The next morning, he returned to the photo. He didn't want to, but something inside him knew that if he didn't look, if he looked away, something worse would happen. The image had changed. Margaret's hand was no longer angled downward. It was higher, closer to the camera, closer to him. The doll's empty sleeve, previously hollow, now showed a faint outline. 5 thin impressions, finger-shaped, as if something had slipped halfway back in. He reached out without realizing it, stopped himself inches from the screen. The pressure in his hand intensified instantly, as if something on the other side had noticed the gesture and responded. That's when he understood. The photograph wasn't being restored. It was being completed. A second expert was brought in, quietly, unofficially. A man who specialized in anomalous historical media. He refused to give his real name. He studied the image once. Just once. Then he shut the laptop. "This isn't a haunting," he said. "It's a transfer." He explained it simply. In times of mass death, wars, epidemics, disasters, some spirits didn't move on cleanly. They attached to objects. People. Especially children. Children were anchors. They could hold what adults couldn't. Margaret wasn't haunted. She was assigned. The doll was not a toy. It was a vessel, and the hand in the photo belonged to the thing inside it. Something that needed a grip. Something that could not cross over unless someone held it long enough. "How long?" the collector asked. The man shook his head. "Until someone else takes over." That night, the collector dreamed again. This time, the boarding house was full. Beds lined the halls. People lay still beneath blankets. Some breathed, some didn't. Margaret walked between them, small feet silent on the floor, dragging the doll behind her. Wherever she passed, the breathing stopped. Not violently, gently, as if permission had been given. When he woke up, the doll was closer to his bed. The clenched sleeve rested on the mattress. And for the first time, he felt fingers close around his own. By the fourth night, the grip no longer felt foreign. That realization frightened him more than the pain. The pressure around his hand had become constant, present even while awake, even while moving. Not heavy, not crushing. Just there, like a child holding on in a crowded place, afraid of being lost. He wrapped his wrist in gauze. It did nothing. The marks appeared beneath it anyway. The doll began to change. Its fabric darkened, especially around the seams. The empty sleeve no longer lay flat. It twitched occasionally, subtle enough that doubt could survive, but real enough that he stopped blinking for long stretches of time. The button eyes no longer reflected light evenly. One always seemed to watch him. He returned to the boarding house ruins. The building had been torn down years ago, replaced by a gravel lot behind a closed factory. But the ground still remembered. Old foundations left impressions. Shadows fell in the wrong places. Standing there, his hand throbbed violently. The pressure tightened, as if the thing holding him knew where it was. He dug, not deep, just enough to disturb the soil. The smell came immediately. Old rot, old cloth, and beneath it something smooth. A child's wrist bone, still wrapped in fabric. The police were never called, because when he looked closer, he saw the fabric wasn't clothing. It was doll cloth, stitched, bound, used. The expert had warned him. A transfer. Someone had to hold on. Margaret had done it first. And when she couldn't anymore, the photograph found someone new. Back in his apartment, the photograph was no longer on the desk. It hung on the wall, centered, perfectly level. Margaret's eyes now looked straight out of the frame, at him. Her hand, once holding the doll, now reached forward, toward the viewer, toward the present. He finally understood the hand. It didn't belong to the dead child. It belonged to the next one, the living hand, slowly being replaced. His fingers began to stiffen. The skin around his knuckles darkened, veins standing out sharply, too sharply. When he looked in the mirror, his right hand no longer matched the left. It looked older, tighter, wrong. The doll lay open on the floor, its stitches torn, empty. Whatever had been inside it was gone. And whatever it needed, it had found him. That night, the final dream came. Margaret stood beside him, older now, relieved. Her hand was free. "You're very good at holding," she said softly, and then she let go. When authorities later entered the apartment, they found no sign of struggle. No doll, no photograph, just a single image printed and left behind on the table. A new photograph, taken recently. In it stood a man, alone, holding a doll. And if you zoomed in, you could see his hand wasn't his anymore. The photograph was cataloged quietly. No press release. No exhibition. No public record. Just a sealed evidence envelope labeled, "Unidentified, found property." Inside it was the image of a grown man standing stiffly in a dim apartment, eyes unfocused, posture rigid. In his arms rested the same cloth doll, aged beyond reason, its fabric darker now, heavier with something time could not explain. And his hand. Everyone who saw it noticed the same thing. It was not posed. It was working. The fingers were locked tight around the doll's wrist, tendons raised, knuckles strained white beneath skin that looked stretched thin. The hand appeared older than the rest of him, older than it should have been, etched with lines that did not match the man's age, as if it had lived a longer life, as if it had held on for years. The man was never found. Neighbors said they heard footsteps pacing late into the night for several days. Then nothing. No movement. No sound. No smell of decay. Just absence. When the apartment was cleared, the walls bore faint impressions, hand-shaped smudges near doorways, hallways, corners. Always at child height. Always reaching. The photograph should have ended the cycle. It didn't. It completed it. Weeks later, a junior archivist reviewing unrelated post-war media noticed something odd. The original 1945 photo, the one with Margaret, had changed again. Margaret was no longer holding the doll. Her hand was empty, relaxed, at rest. Her expression had softened, just slightly, as if she had been released from a duty she had carried far too long. But the doll was still there, not in her arms, at her feet, upright, waiting. The archivist reported sudden numbness in her right hand that same afternoon. By morning, she couldn't close her fingers without pain. She requested time off. She never returned. The pattern was undeniable now. The photograph didn't curse people randomly. It chose those who looked too closely, those who tried to understand, those who stayed. Children had always been the first choice, but adults would do, especially ones who believed they could let go. In 1945, the world was filled with the newly dead. The war ended, but no one knew where to put all the grief. Some of it stayed behind. Some of it needed to be held. And somewhere between the click of a shutter and the soft tearing sound of cloth being stitched closed, a promise was made. Not spoken, but understood. Someone will hold on, so the rest can leave. The doll was not evil. It was a tool. The hand was not monstrous. It was necessary. And the little girl in the photograph, she was not cursed. She was trained. Because the most dangerous thing a spirit can be is unfinished. The final record associated with the photograph was never meant to be found. It existed only as a maintenance log entry, typed, unsigned, and buried among hundreds of routine notes. Image removed from cold storage at 2:14 a.m. Returned at 2:17 a.m. No staff present. Security footage from that night showed nothing unusual. No movement. No doors opening. No one entering or leaving. But when the image was checked the next morning, it had changed. Again, the little girl from 1945 no longer looked toward the camera. She was looking down at her hand. Empty now. The doll was gone. In its place, standing just behind her, was a shape the restorers had never seen before. Tall. Unfocused. Human only in outline. And at its side, held firmly in its grasp, was a new hand. Adult. Living. Unmistakably real. The truth became clear too late. The photograph was not a record of something that happened. It was a mechanism. A relay. A way of passing responsibility from one holder to the next. Margaret had been taught to hold the doll. The doll had been taught to hold the dead. And when the world changed, when children could no longer be asked, the image adapted. It chose anyone willing to look long enough. The last confirmed sighting of the photograph occurred during a private estate auction. No listing. No catalog number. Just a framed print leaning against a wall. A woman paused while passing it. Witnesses said she stared for a long time. Long enough to miss a bid. Long enough to reach out. She purchased nothing that day. But she left holding something. Weeks later, a new image surfaced online. Low resolution, poor lighting. A modern photograph taken on a phone. A woman standing alone in a hallway. In her arms, a cloth doll. Old. One sleeve empty. The other clenched tight. Comments flooded in before the post was removed. People asked about the doll. About the grip. About the strange way her hand looked too tense. Too aged. Too practiced. Someone typed, "Why does it look like she's afraid to let go?" Because she was. If you ever find an old photograph that feels heavier the longer you stare, if you notice a hand that doesn't quite belong, if something in the image looks like it's waiting for you to notice it, don't zoom in. Don't restore it. And whatever you do, don't reach out. Some things survived the war because someone held them back. And once you take that hand, it never lets go. Welcome to Forgotten Remains, where the past isn't gone. It's just waiting for someone to hold it.